So hello and a very warm welcome to all of you. And thank you so much. This is a great opportunity for all of us, the development practitioners, the economists. The name of William Easterly is, he needs no introduction at all. And we'll hear him speak shortly. While doing some research on you to try and pen down what I would say today, I went through several of your publications and your books as well. And so the last one that you've written in 2022, I think, The Elusive Quest for Growth. Latest publication is Economists' Adventures and Misadventures in the Tropics. So I think some of the discussion will be around this publication as well. And one review that really caught my attention, and I think that kind of summarizes our perception of you, said that this is an important, controversial, unusual, and accessible book. It is destined to be an influential and enduring contribution to the development economics literature. So I think that sort of summarizes most of your work. Manny is a friend to you. I will call Manny onto the stage to introduce you, and then we'd like to hear from Professor.
Since he needs no introduction, I'm not sure why I'm here. But let me just, first of all, thank ERCD for hosting this jointly. So Albert and Joe is here, and Albert's online. I think it's a great opportunity for us to meet in person. Bill, as professor of economics at NYU and director of its Development Research Institute, Bill is well known to all of us as development economists through his contributions in the peer-reviewed literature. You need a lot of those if you want to be graduate from MIT, be lead economist at the research department of the World Bank, and also professor at a prestigious university in the United States. But Bill is that rare individual who is a rigorous research economist who can write. Right? And as Saleha mentioned, he's able to, when he does this, he communicates to a broader world through his books that have become standards, not just in reading lists at universities, but in book clubs in communities all over the world. So Saleha mentioned The Elusive Search for Growth. There's also The White Man's Burden and The Tyranny of Experts. That's us, by the way. And there are many messages in all these books. But let me just take the opportunity to tell you about three that I keep in mind as I try to practice my dubious profession. The first is Bill always tells us to keep your eye on the impact of what we do on the ultimate beneficiary in all of these books. We care a lot about KPIs, and especially in the World Bank and the AEB, but really it's about the world's poor vulnerable. Second message that resonates with me in Bill's books is be humble and learn from those ultimate beneficiaries. Listen to them and tailor your interventions accordingly. Again, for organizations like ourselves, in which we have to get volume out, we have basically trying to get away from the one-size-fits-all mode, but it's really hard. That's a message that we need to keep in mind. And the third thing is be realistic. Design what can be achieved. Small victories matter, rather than looking for the really big win, which is elusive, as Bill would put it. Bill's also a hero to us who are independent evaluators and independent researchers, because Bill speaks truth to power. He was still at the World Bank when he wrote Elusive Search for Growth. I know we're in the same department, Bill. And it took a lot of courage to tell it like it is. And because some of the questions he raised may be inconvenient and uncomfortable, but they're always thought-provoking and always important. So with that, please join me in welcoming Bill Easterly.
Thank you, Manny, for that kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you to see you in person and not over Zoom. And for those on Zoom, thank you for tuning in anyway. So I'm going to talk to you this morning about facing the challenge of donors' self-interest in foreign aid. We often take for granted that foreign aid donors have an altruistic goal of reducing world poverty. But we know we've been worried in the aid business for a long time that donors might also have self-interest, that they might be acting in their own self-interest, and that self-interest might lead them to behave in ways that limit aid effectiveness, that limit the ability of aid to effectively fight world poverty and to have aid reach the ultimate beneficiaries, the world's poor. So, for example, during the Cold War, we all sort of agreed that aid was not working that well because aid was going to corrupt autocrats who were allies of the West, or the United States in particular, in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. There's some feeling when we talk about the Cold War that those were sort of the bad old days that have never come back and things are a lot better now. So what we're going to review today is that really true? Is there still a problem, much like the Cold War, of donor self-interest, of political self-interest? And there's a big development that happened during my lifetime and career in development aid, and that was the terrorist attack that happened on September 11th, 2001, which marked a very sudden change in US national security priorities for giving aid. That now aid would also be used as a tool to fight the war on terror, to protect the national security of the United States or of the UK and a few other donors. So that was a change that we might worry that once again there's a surge in the self-interest of donors happening associated with this event. Of course, I don't want to automatically imply that self-interest is morally wrong. Every nation in the world is self-interested. All of us as individuals are self-interested. The point is, how do we kind of take into account the understandable self-interest going on with aid and take into account how that does affect the business that we are in of trying to have aid reach the world's poor. So this event in 2001 is helpful in our research and analysis because we can sort of isolate this experiment where suddenly there was this big change in the self-interest of donors, especially the US. But there was no sudden change in the needs of the world's poor. The world's poor were just as poor the day after 9/11 as they were before. There were no poorer, no richer. There was no abrupt change in the need for poverty relief. There was also no abrupt change in conflict worldwide that happened around 2001. Of course, the terrorist attack itself was a huge burst of violence. But as far as violence in the developing world, it actually declined in the new millennium from some of the violence that was happening in the 90s, such as the Eritrea-Ethiopia war. And so violence had actually shifted down at the time of 2001, the break that we're looking at today. So any break that we see around 2001 seems mostly to do with self-interest, and that can kind of give us a clue what will be the effect of self-interest on aid and how will that affect the effectiveness of aid. So here's kind of the announcement of the aid policy shift that happened right after 2001. President Bush gave a speech to an international aid conference in Monterrey, Mexico on March 22nd, 2002. He said, "We fight against poverty because hope is an answer to terror." Bush said that aid would help fix what he called failed governments, which are also known at the time as failed states, later fragile states, now known mostly as fragile and conflict-affected situations, which is a huge mouthful, but is not so insulting to the recipients of this analysis. And so there's really sort of a sea change at this time in the interest in development that's happening. And I observed this myself very vividly when this was happening. I remember that there are suddenly new actors coming into the foreign aid business that nobody had anticipated before. I still remember when I was spending a short time in 2002 at the International Institute for Economics. Fred Bergson, the director of economics, called us into his office, and he was very excited because there was a new actor getting involved in foreign aid, and it was literally an actor. It was Angelina Jolie, who's now going to join the aid business. So unbeknownst to Angelina, she was sort of a harbinger of this sudden big interest in development in the US. But it was an interest that was mainly motivated by the idea of using aid and development to fight the war on terror. So the big increase in aid that Bush actually announced in 2002, a lot of it was going to go to allies in the war on terror. And the problem was going to be that the allies in the war on terror, on average, had poor quality institutions. And also Bush was going to emphasize a lot aid to countries in conflict, which also had poor quality institutions. So the challenge was going to be that suddenly after 9/11, there's a lot more aid. That's a great thing. That's good. The problem is that a lot more aid is going to be increasingly directed to allies in the war on terror with poor institutions, and aid in the presence of poor institutions is a lot less likely to be effective at reaching the world's poor. So here's some evidence on aid effectiveness in conflict zones, for example. So there's kind of a wide consensus that aid is less effective in the presence of poor quality institutions. So I'm giving the conflict as an example, but it could just as well be corruption or autocracy or absence of rule of law or any of those things. So this study in 2017 had the finding that aid in conflict zones is more likely to exacerbate violence than to dampen violence. So these studies were actually finding that aid in this environment, in the environment of conflict, not only was not working positively, but could actually be working negatively to increase violence. And of course, with increased violence, the poor were going to suffer even more. The violence increasing effect occurs when aid is misappropriated by violent actors. And so that what this study and many others had in mind, and this was documented with formal econometric results, but the kind of anecdotes they had in mind were how the Taliban in Afghanistan were charging security fees to NGOs and official aid agencies in order to allow them to operate in the field in insecure places. And then, of course, the Taliban could use the security fees to pay for additional soldiers and weapons and so on and make the violence even worse. Or another way that, so that violence increasing effect occurs when aid is misappropriated by violent actors, or when violent actors sabotage aid projects in order to disrupt the cooperation between the local population and the government. So this is a really sad way in which aid is sort of compromised, that even in cases where aid was working effectively to benefit the population, the violent insurgents would have an incentive to disrupt, to sabotage that aid effort, and so undo the benefits and the gains that aid was achieving, because the insurgents didn't want aid to work. They didn't want aid to work because that would hamper their ability to play on the discontent of the population, to fuel the insurgency further. One really tragic reflection of this is that there are over 200 aid workers that were killed in the field during the war in Afghanistan. It's sort of a tragic and under kind of covered aspect of the tragedy of the aid business in these times of conflict. And of course, conflict is also correlated with poor governance on other dimensions. Societies that have conflict are usually the same ones that have, there's usually a lot of a serious problem with corruption. Usually the governments are not very accountable to their citizens in these environments. The rule of law is obviously a lot more likely to be absent. And so these are the kind of really difficult environments that the sort of priority of the priority of the US to give aid to allies in the war on terror is directing aid into these environments where it's going to be less effective. So let me show you this with some data and sort of illustrate sort of what should have happened and then what actually did happen. So the first graph I'm going to show you is sort of what should have happened. So this is an average for what was going on with aid and governance and poverty after 9/11. So these data points are all averages over the period 2002 to 2019. On the vertical axis here is the average score on one of the World Bank's governance indicators, the governance indicator known as political stability and the absence of violence and terrorism. So here, a movement upward on the vertical scale means more political stability and less violence. And a movement down on the vertical scale is more political instability and more violence. And then on the horizontal axis is initial per capita income of each country whose data point I'm recording here. So for example, Afghanistan, AFG, you can see in the lower left, that's a country at a very low initial income and a very high level of violence, very violent situation affecting all the actors in that economy. And then going up, you could find countries with the same level of per capita income with much better institutional quality as far as political stability and absence of violence. So the challenge of donors is to find a way to direct aid to those that are in need, but to find a way to do that so that it's not compromising the effectiveness of aid. Find a way to direct aid into environments where it will help the poor, where there are a lot of poor people, but also environments where the aid will actually have the favorable conditions to actually reach poor people. And so the sort of target for donors, and there's sort of a wide consensus on this, is to sort of select as much as possible on both institutional quality and poverty. Not to select only on poverty, but also select on institutional quality. So that would direct donors to sort of this region encircled by my beautifully artistic scrawl of orange around the sort of desirable zone where donors could operate. These are the environments that donors should want to go to according to this consensus. Sort of in this upper left-hand quadrant, there's both high need and high institutional quality, and that's what you want. On the lower left-hand quadrant, you have high needs, but low institutional quality. So there your aid is going to be seriously compromised by the idea of there will be a lot of poverty, a lot of need, but aid will be seriously rendered less effective to actually reach poor people. So that's sort of the target. That's the consensus. That would have been my advice to the aid agencies. Let's see if my own country, my beloved agency, USAID, is actually following this advice. So here's the same graph, and here the red X's are the countries that were in the top 25% of US aid receipts in the period 2002 to 2019. So in contrast to my advice to focus on this quadrant, the upper left quadrant, the USAID is actually going to the lower left quadrant, in which there is need, but there is so much political instability and violent situations that aid is a lot less likely to reach those in need in these situations. So this is kind of the big challenge of donors. So donors, of course, have to deal with the fact that it is, of course, true that institutional quality and poverty are correlated in such a way that the countries where you want to get, the countries that are in need of a lot of aid because of high poverty are usually the same countries that also have more difficult institutions as far as corruption and autocracy and violence and political instability and so on. But the donors can try to compensate for that by selecting on the institutional quality conditional on the level of need. So that's what we all wanted them to do in this graph, that they would select the best institutional quality possible conditional on need. And what the US actually did in practice was the reverse. It actually selected seemingly the most political instability and violence for a given amount of need. And so not even a neutral policy, but actually going in a direction that seemingly made aid even more likely to not reach the world's poor, not reach the poor in these countries. Let me give you also a little graph that is using some other data that goes back to 2008 on where the different multilaterals, bilaterals stand on this this idea of you want to reach both poor people, but also you want to direct aid into good environments. So in this graph on the horizontal axis is the share of each agency's aid that goes to what in this paper was called free and clean countries, meaning clean hands and democratically accountable governments. So governments that had a sort of minimum level of democracy and accountability, and also had corruption under control. So defining that group of countries, what percent of each agency's aid went to those countries? So here, a movement to the right on the vertical, a movement to the right on the horizontal axis in the direction of more aid going to good institutional environments is a good thing. And then on the vertical axis is the share of each agency's aid that went to the poorest countries in the world. So classifying countries as low income, middle income, and so on, according to conventional standards. This is the share of aid from each agency that went to the world's poorest countries, that went to low income countries as opposed to middle income countries. So the desirable region is the upper right-hand quadrant here. So you want to be in this, region of the upper right. That is the desirable place to be. The region you really don't want to be in is the lower left. So in the upper right, the donors are doing as well as they can to sort of have the best of both worlds, to give aid to countries that both have good institutional quality, where aid is likely to be effective, but countries that are also poor to begin with, so they have a lot of poor that are in need of aid. In the lower left, we have sort of donors doing the opposite. They don't succeed in giving aid to countries that have good institutions. They also don't succeed in giving aid to countries that have a lot of poverty, so they don't give much aid to poor people. They don't give much aid to good institutions. And so this is the quadrant of shame that donors are really doing the exact opposite of what would be best practice. So in the upper right-hand quadrant, the sort of nice quadrant, I didn't realize that before coming here to give this talk, I sort of looked at this graph and I said, I better check where ADB is going to be. So I can be, diplomatic and polite to my generous and kind hosts. So you can see, actually, you made it into the upper right quadrant. ASDF is you, if I understand correctly. And then you're joined by some other happy company of IDA, the World Bank's aid arm, IMF, to the extent it gives something somewhat like aid, is also in that quadrant. So you see, there's actually the multilaterals are sort of more likely to be in this good quadrant of targeting both good institutions and poverty. Then in the quadrant of shame, we have the US, of course, most obviously. So that's the one I'm talking about now. So this I'm going to keep arguing has a lot to do with US self-interest, that it was in the US interest to prioritize the war on terror and not fighting poverty. And they wound up in the quadrant of shame. I'm less sure what's going on in Italy and Austria, to be honest. Are doing sort of as badly as it's possible to do in the aid business. I don't know, I have to confess, I don't know a lot about the glorious Austrian aid effort in fighting world poverty. Is there anybody here who knows anything about Austria or is from Austria or Italy? Either one, anybody? Yeah, I was hoping there would be. I was going to ask them, sort of, what is your problem? What is going on here? Do you call yourself an aid agency or just something else? And then, the other quadrants are sort of aid agencies that are sort of facing the difficult choice, which is, it's very difficult to give aid to poor countries that do have good institutions. So you're sort of faced with this devil's choice. Do you give a lot of aid to countries that are poor but have not very good institutions? Or do you give a lot of aid to countries that have good institutions but don't have many poor? That's sort of the inherent difficulty that donors have to struggle with. And that's always true, no matter how much self-interest is going on or not. What's sad about the post-2001 period is how much the US and other donors seem to be sort of becoming like imitators of Italy and Austria, and just choosing bad institutions conditional on poverty, not doing a good job of targeting either institutions or poverty. Now, if you have any doubts that USAID might be self-interested, it's helpful when the defendant themselves confess in court, in open court. So here USAID actually tells us that they are advancing US national security and economic prosperity. Economic prosperity there means US economic prosperity, not necessarily economic prosperity of the recipients, and definitely the national security needs of the US. In case you think I'm kind of being kind of tactless and putting this in highlighted bold letters, the red boldface is actually in the original. So, and they're on the website that I can direct you to. It's under what we do. This is sort of the first thing that popped up in red bold letters. We are here to advance US national security and, a little bit of development and poverty reduction also. And so that sort of tells you most of what you need to know about where this tendency that I showed you in the graph came from, that you needed to prioritize the recipients that helped you in the war on terror that were not helping you that much in the war on poverty. So the main results that I'm not showing you kind of all the tedious statistical details, but the results that I had from analyzing the data over 2002 to 2019 and the shift that happened after 2001, the main finding of that exercise was just that both the US and all of the donors before 2001 had actually targeted good institutions conditional on need. So they were doing the best that they could to sort of, you wanted to direct aid, of course, to countries in need. You don't want to send aid to Switzerland just because it has good institutions. So you want to send aid to countries that have a lot of poverty, but conditional on that objective of sending aid to poor countries, you also want to choose among the set of poor countries those that have the best quality institutions. So selecting good institutions conditional on need was actually happening in the data that I saw before 2001. Then after 2001, there was this very strong, highly statistically significant shift in the opposite direction, so that you were not only no longer selecting on good institutions, you were even sometimes, as I showed you in the graph that I showed you with USAID, actually selecting on bad institutions, which can only be explained by sort of the donor's self-interest of prioritizing who helps them in the war on terror and not as much who helps them in the war on poverty. So donors strongly shifted away from positive selection on governance, conditional on need after 2001. So the conclusion that I'm left with is that the 9/11 shock to self-interest is kind of a good clue on how self-interest operates in affecting our business of trying to have aid reach the world's poor. That it happened in a way that was going to dramatically lower aid effectiveness at reaching the world's poor, because USAID shifted towards badly governed environments. So donors failed after 2001, donors failed to follow the recommended optimal policy of positively selecting on governance relative to need. And so our attached conclusion is aid was less likely to be effective than before after 2001 in reducing global poverty. So leaving us, I typically do wind up at a place in talks that leaves everyone sort of depressed and hoping, kind of, why did I come to this talk? I could have watched a depressing movie instead. So I want to try to be somewhat constructive and suggest some questions that we can discuss now in the period we have for discussion. One possibility, which I've always been hopeful about, is that the real purpose of aid criticism is always to make aid work better. So us in the business of being aid critics, we're not just trying to destroy aid, we're trying to make aid work better. One thing we could hope for, and on this topic, is we could just convince the rich country publics themselves. We could go over the heads of the US officials and the policymakers and President Bush and his successors and just appeal directly to the American people. If you really want to fight poverty, don't do this. Don't use aid as a weapon in the war on terror. You can fight the war on terror with other things that might be available to you, but don't subordinate aid to the needs of national defense. We want our aid, speaking for the American people, to go to the world's desperately poor people. So we could hope that maybe the effect of this kind of discussion might have some effect on the aid discussion among the rich country republics and all donor countries. It's also suggestive the patterns we've seen today, that maybe things will be better with multilaterals than with bilaterals, which I was also calculating would be a relatively popular message for this audience. Just shift aid away from the bilaterals and give it to the multilaterals. That seems to be supported by this analysis. Of course, you can tell me whether you think multilaterals are indeed perfectly insulated from political interests of the donor countries. You can let me know on that. I might be a little naive about that. And then last of all, even if the constraints of serving donor self-interest is going to mean that aid goes into a poor institutional environment, are there types of aid that maybe the aid agencies can opt for that would still be more effective in a poor institutional environment? You guys might have some suggestions, I might have some suggestions, but it seems like in practice, you could just try to confront the problem directly, and that we're sort of forced by the donors' interest into going to some really difficult environments. But in those difficult environments, are there kinds of aid or kinds of projects that would work better than others to kind of cope with the difficult environment? So I will leave you there, and I look really forward to the discussion we will have now about these questions. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you very much, Bill. I think that shows you that Bill leaves no prisoners sometimes. So that's exactly the kind of thought-provoking talk that we were looking for. So this is going to be a conversation not between me and Bill, but between all of you and Bill. I'm just here to try to moderate. So if you would like to say something, comment, or ask a question, please just go to the microphone. And also my colleagues here are monitoring the questions that are coming online. So please just come up. I know that people are oddly enough shy here, Bill. So they're thinking about who's going to be the first to ask a question. Let me ask one. And in 2001, a lot of other things also happened, including the fact that you had a more conservative government coming into the US. To what extent was it terrorism, or was it just politics that drive some of these results?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the interesting thing is that we normally associate sort of hostility to aid in the US with Republicans and kind of positive attitudes toward aid with the Democrats. So other things equal, if there had been no influence of 9/11 attacks on aid, I would have thought that Bush would have been more likely to cut aid than to increase aid. Well, what's interesting, we could dig even deeper into how really enthusiastic the Republicans and Bush were about increasing aid. They really got on the bandwagon at this time. They did, Bush did the PEPFAR to fight AIDS in Africa, created the Millennium Challenge Corporation. There were lots of new initiatives that were happening around this time. So it seemed, my best guess as to what is going on is there was sort of this combination of noble humanitarian sentiments, which also played to some of Bush's base among evangelicals, for example. But it was also very convenient to have that enthusiasm as an instrument in the war on terror at the same time.
Thanks very much, Abdul Abiad from the research department. Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. So one comment and one question. I guess the first comment was on the point of the extent to which multilaterals are insulated from donor self-interest. Isn't that something we can actually look at empirically? I mean, was there a shift in multilaterals, aid to shares, right? Did they shift toward down? And so on that, I don't know. And maybe you can tell us whether there's evidence in that shift pre-2001 and post-2001. The question I had, not related to this, is on, you talked about the end of the Cold War. We seem to be moving toward greater fragmentation, and also to aid perhaps being used for, not for the war on terror, but for other political, still self-interest. wanted to hear what you had to say about aid in this new environment. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's too soon to tell what the next shift is, of course, but it seems like the Russia-Ukraine conflict is going to create a very different situation from what happened in the war on terror, perhaps. I mean, I have no, scientific or research basis for hoping that. I'm just, at this point, we're speculating, and then we can test later our speculations. You might think that now there'll be a shift towards at least kind of supporting the idea of democracy, perhaps worldwide, and from the US and UK and some other donors, and seeing that there's sort of, that they perceive some conflict between democracy and autocracy worldwide. So there could be sort of another flip, another switch at this point towards it's sort of the opposite of what we're seeing during the war on terror, that now you want to kind of select allies who are democratic governments for the conflict with Russia. So that could be an interesting shift going on now. Certainly, probably the kind of dynamics on the war on terror probably mostly disappearing at this point because of the collapse in Afghanistan and other things.
And we have online Albert.
Thanks, Bill. Very interesting. The question I put into the chat was, a lot of the ADB and World Bank activity is obviously sovereign lending, not aid. I'm assuming the analysis you did is just focusing on the aid component. Has anyone tried to analyze the lending side, both sovereign and even non-sovereign? Someone told me that USAID was also now putting a lot of political criteria on its non-sovereign or kind of private sector lending as well, which is quite different, I think, than some of the other private sector lending operations of other multilaterals.
Well, Manny mentioned in the introduction the importance of being humble. So, Albert, I have to say, unfortunately, I would love to know the answers to your questions, and I haven't looked at that data. I don't know them. So it's important to be humble and say, I have no clue. Occasionally, questions like that, I think it definitely would be worth investigating.
Can I follow up with one more? This will be my last. So, have you identified any quantitative indicators of what you're defining as self-interest, the political goals that are affecting the decisions? Because if we had those indicators, then we could maybe do some simple regressions or see if there's any evidence that poverty and governance still matter if you control for kind of these other political factors.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. It's not that easy to do kind of objective measures of political interest. One that I've done in Africa, but it only works for Africa, is look at the U.S. Africa Command website. The U.S. set up an Africa Command after 2001. And on the website, the U.S. actually identifies who are their allies in Africa during, in the aftermath of 9/11, during the war on terror. So that would be kind of an objective indicator of the military allies of the U.S. who are also getting more economic aid. And of course, always when we're talking about aid in this discussion, we're only talking about economic aid, development aid. We're not talking about military aid, which is also increasing to the same recipients at the same time. We're not looking at that right now. So it's definitely the case that there's the surge in aid is concentrated a lot among the allies, at least within Africa. And of course, those same allies also have these kind of difficult institutions as far as corruption, autocracy, political instability, violence, etc. So that's one case we could do that. We could hope we could maybe do that worldwide and kind of finding other lists of who the allies are, and then kind of calculating how big the aid increases are for allies. I know from at least from the Africa exercise, there is a lot larger increase in aid to the Africa allies than there were to non-allies in Africa, on the order of 170% for the allies and 30% for the non-allies in the average annual aid flows before and after 2001.
There was some Ben, there was someone in the back, please.
No, I think Ben was taking the mic.
Okay, all right.
I'm Ben. I work with Manny in the evaluation department.
Lucky man.
Thanks. Your data showed IDA and Asian Development Fund are equivalent of IDA. And
Right,
so
right.
it's intuitive because both these funds allocate resources, taking into account policies and institutions of governance, as well as poverty levels and increasingly vulnerability, economic and environmental vulnerability. So
Right.
I think that answers a little bit Albert's question, that it's really just looking at these two specific funds, which are much smaller relative to the entire lending of the two institutions. So I thought I'd just make that point. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point. So yeah, I know the World Bank. I don't know as much about ADB operations. The World Bank has these CPIA ratings that are supposed to be kind of rigorously and objectively influencing where the aid goes. I'm not sure that for the World Bank operations that I know and that I knew when I was at the World Bank for 16 years, it wasn't that obvious that this objective direction towards better quality institutions and policies was actually working, that there seemed to be some kind of manipulation still possible in how you rated kind of some dubious countries got overrated and other countries implicitly penalized by that exercise.
Thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. I must admit, I was in New York on 9/11, and as a Muslim American lawyer, I was very focused on kind of internal war on politics, the Patriot Act, and that kind of lobbying and those types of issues. So I didn't actually follow this. It's very, very interesting to see, especially now that I'm here. My question, actually two questions I have is, one regarding this bargain that we made with allies. Did we get what we bargained for? I'd like to just get some sense of, since we put so much concentration, what actually happened. And then, but my main question is actually related to your first point about publicizing problem to the public. I used to work with Interaction. I don't know if you know Interaction in DC. I was an advisor to the president, and we had this Hill Day. I don't know if you've heard, we would go on Capitol Hill and kind of lobby Michigan and other kind of states on why foreign aid was so important. And my question is, you raise that as a discussion, but how effective has that become? Because one of the things, even now that I'm at ADB, I'm going to Michigan next week. I feel very strongly that people in the heartland, including your state, Ohio and other places, need to make that link.
I confess to you that I'm from Ohio.
Yes, you did.
I usually try to hide that, but
I will not use that against you, but I will definitely consider it. But I think that my question is how important is it to make that link between the heartland America and what this aid has actually done and not done? Because I think after almost 20 some years, we can assess the decisions we made earlier. So just to sum up, basically, thank you so much. This is really important. I didn't really consider this because I was so focused internally. Secondly, I think that now is a time to kind of assess what did we get, what we bargained for. And lastly, and most importantly, in terms of, efficacy of like Interaction and others engaging with the public, particularly within the heartland of the US, has this made an impact? And if so, what was that impact? Thank you.
yeah, those are really interesting things to look at. Again, I want to be humble. I'm not a national security expert. I'm not a terrorism expert. I don't know how well all of this worked, that the allies were successful in helping the US in the war on terror. I mean, just casual observation as a US voter suggests there wasn't, super glorious success in the things that involved the allies in Afghanistan and Iraq and African allies and, the conflicts in Somalia and so on. So, maybe part of the lesson is, forcing, arguably, and this is very well known in the kind of the aid literature, that you really have to set goals clearly and not try to do too many goals at the same time. So USAID, for example, arguably was very hampered by the fact that it had to do sort of two very separate goals that were often in conflict with each other. The national security objectives and the development poverty reduction objectives. And arguably, maybe the Defense Department had the same problem, that it was supposed to fight the war on terror, but it was also supposed to cooperate on development. And, as we know from kind of any basic organizational theory or the idea of specialization in general, trying to do two things at once is a lot worse than just being specialized and having one goal. And so arguably, it would have been a lot better if there had been a firewall between development and defense. And USAID was just told, don't worry about defense, don't worry about the war on terror, just go fight poverty. And the Defense Department was told, you know, forget this kind of illusion of, you know, making development and defense kind of cooperate with each other. That's not really, there really is a trade-off, and they really don't work well together. Just do defense should do defense, development should do development. And that sadly did not happen for political reasons. So we're left with sort of the worst of all worlds, perhaps.
Hi, Professor Jason. My name's Amit Zeta. I'm one of the vice presidents here. It's extraordinary privilege to have you here. I'm quite jealous to many when I heard that you guys work together actually at World Bank, and I've been reading your work for many years and have benefited from it greatly. I wanted to just share, I want to make a couple of quick reactions, but you'll see there's some questions embedded in them if you could react to them. One of the reasons I was so interested in your talk is because I was at the US Treasury from 2004 to 2008 and ran both the Middle East and Africa at that time. And so had an insider perspective on some of the issues that you're talking about. And so a couple of things that just struck me. You know, the first is that it's not actually, it felt to me like this was an embedded assumption that the dollars that were made available for Afghanistan and Iraq were otherwise available for poverty alleviation efforts. But I don't think that that is entirely true. You know, the various institutions of government were seeking to align themselves with the war on terrorism because it was a fast track procurement process. So if you're in Treasury and you want money for what you do, you call it terrorism. Okay? If you're an AID, you rebrand yourself as an agent of the war on terrorism. And so I think there's some quantum of capital that was really only there because it was about terrorism, not because it was about poverty alleviation. So that was one, and that's a function.
Respond to that one
before we go to
your next point. So I think this is a really important point, that the sort of humanitarian advocates of fighting poverty, or perhaps we're willing to accept this kind of trade-off that you're talking about, that you're going to get more money for development, more money to fight poverty, on the condition that that money is going to be directed in ways that they knew would make it less effective also. So you have this, you hope that you were sort of having an offsetting effect, that you would get more aid money and, you know, partially offset by lower effectiveness. You hope still that things would come out positive on average for doing that trade-off. And so, you know, I don't think it did come out well, but I think it's sort of very understandable that even the humanitarians were willing to play along with this alliance between the war on terror and the war on poverty.
Yeah, I think maybe one reaction and then to the second point, which I think relates to this too, is if that quantum of capital is truly not available, your average effectiveness is going down, right? But your stock of effectiveness may actually be going up in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the relationship's complicated. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
The second, then, I think, which builds on that, is that whether it was for reasons of self-interest or because of belief, there was a theory of the case that was being propagated about the relationship between the war on terrorism and poverty itself. And it may be, I suspect strongly that it is true, that that theory of the case was fundamentally flawed, that terrorism was not a product of poverty, it was a product of other things, and perhaps poverty was a fellow traveler, or in some ways, actually, there are arguments that early stages of economic growth can enhance instability as opposed to damage.
Yeah, I mean, that's also another super important point, that it sort of became convenient to tell the story that poverty was the root of terrorism.
Yeah.
And yeah, and that's sort of another clue into sort of the self-interest going on here, because that argument was immediately contradicted by lots of academics and, you know, even more casual anecdotal observations that terrorism was coming from kind of middle income segments of middle income countries that were not coming out of dire poverty, were by far not the poorest places in the world, even relatively affluent places. Terrorism was terrorists were emerging from those places. So it was just completely not true that poverty was causing terrorism. And the fact that that was kind of the story that was still embraced despite that evidence is kind of another clue to how much self-interest is driving the train here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. You just look at the biographies of the 9/11 terrorists, right?
Right.
And so then I think there's another piece of that, right, which I want to just ask you about, which is when we conclude that self-interest is ineffective, there is also an ideology embedded within the approach about what works in FCAS, what we call FCAS environments, which is this private sector ethos. And so question, is it possible a different approach to fragile and conflict affected states, one that relies less on a tool that may not be appropriate for that particular context? Could it, in other words, is it, the self-interest clearly is corrosive in some ways and it is connected with some wrong assumptions. But then is it possible that some of the poor results we see are also at the level of tools and policy choices which operate one level below that? So that was the second comment. Third, I was just reflecting because the multilateral to bilateral contrast was interesting. And it reminded me that even the multilaterals are often an outgrowth of national security interests. This institution, the government of Japan, was interested in creating for some time before Lyndon Johnson became interested because of Vietnam. So is there some value to directing national security interests towards frameworks that will be more rules and principles based because they'll be more effective over time? I guess this gets to some of your questions about, you know, what is the argument you want to make to the American people? Where do you want to take that interest? And how do you want to direct it? And then just two very small observations because I had seen some things that were relevant to it. We were sort of speculating about President Bush and his administration. I think there's a very strong messianic impulse there. That's something that you've talked about in some of your work. Very well meaning, but it fit within a broader narrative that I think you've highlighted earlier in some of what you've written, right? And then the last thing is that,
Bono and Angelina Savior complex.
yeah, right. Yeah. And then the last thing, which I at least thought was interesting, and I thought I would just mention, is that the boundary between national security and economic assistance isn't just disappearing on the side of the economic actors. It's also disappearing on the side of the national security actors. And so, you know, the Defense Department talks so much more about economics today, especially in internal, than is imaginable. And actually, if you go into what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, colonels and generals are making the argument that we have to be on the front line of distributing economic aid, because they also bought into this broader narrative of the link between economic inequality and political disruption. So anyways, I just thought I would love it if you could just react to some of those. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the last one, I know I and a lot of my fellow economists are getting lots of invitations after 2001 to go speak to Defense Department and intelligence agencies, and so that definitely confirms what you're saying. I think they weren't super receptive to my message, which is just don't do development, just do what you know about, do defense, and don't try to do development. Leave that to somebody else. They were not receptive to that message, clearly.
There are a couple of questions that have been posted online. One is from, just can you scroll up there? Norman, there's a question back. So Norman LaRock says, thank you for your presentation. In the past 15 years or so, many governments have subsumed their aid agencies into their foreign policy ministries, example, UK, New Zealand, Australia, Canada. Do you have any evidence whether, holding other factors constant, these merged foreign policy aid agencies perform better or worse than standalone aid agencies?
No, I don't know of an easy way to kind of collect that evidence and evaluate that question. It does seem to sort of confirm the same trend going on, right? That there's this sort of, you see these sort of convenient narratives coming out of sort of nowhere, even when they're kind of demonstrably false after 9/11. And again, just keep reiterating what we were talking about earlier, the idea that defense and development and Secretary of State Clinton also threw in the word diplomacy, that these are all, she had this sort of 3Ds approach to whole of government policy, that defense, diplomacy, and development would all work together during her time in office. And that idea certainly recurred under Bush and under people working on development under Trump even. So is that a sensible narrative, that there will be a beneficial effect of these diplomacy, defense, and development working together. And again, it's a very convenient narrative for making everybody happy. Is there any evidence for it? Does it accord with common sense? It seems to fly in the face of common sense that there really are difficult trade-offs, that, doing defense, you have to blow things up. Doing development, you have to build things. Those are kind of two things moving in the opposite direction. You want to do development, you want to build things. If you want to do defense, then you blow things up. That's just sort of common sense trade-off you have between those two. So where is the kind of common sense or evidence coming from to assert that these two things could work together? I don't really see where it was coming from.
Right, there are many other questions, but we are short of time. There's just one statement from Amos. He says, perhaps funding civil society organizations and the governance and legal reform sectors is directionally useful in strengthening weak institutions. So that's a comment. There are many other questions, but in the interest of time, I'll hand it back to Manny.
Yeah, can I just react to that
Yes.
comment? I mean, I think trying to exit some of the gloom and doom we're covering ourselves with today, we could also say where are hopeful things coming from? And I think hopeful things are coming very much from the efforts of civil society and lots of other homegrown reformers and campaigners in poor countries themselves. And, a lot of the success in development over the past 20 years has not been about aid, it's been about homegrown economic reforms and institutional reforms happening in Africa, Asia, Latin America, every part of the developing world. And that I think is a very hopeful, positive trend.
So we'll pass on the other questions to you. Maybe we can email the answers to them, Manny.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid that we have come to the end of our allotted time for this workshop. But I do want to thank Bill and all of you for really a stimulating hour. I hope you can stay a few minutes, Bill, here in the room. I know that there might be others here who taken the trouble to come and want to meet you, maybe get your autographs, but also ask you some difficult questions. But please, for now, please join me in a round of applause to thank Bill Easterly for